The Nebraska sandhills in the winter of 1937 were among the emptiest stretches of open country in the American interior. 480 kilometers of grass-covered dunes rolled westward from the Missouri River toward the Wyoming line, broken only by scattered ranches, isolated freight sidings, and the single track that carried the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad through the least populated counties in the state. There were no towns of any consequence between Alliance and Mullen. In February, the temperature at night fell to 20 degrees below zero, and the wind moved across the open country with nothing to slow it. It was a place where a man could stand outside for 1 full hour and hear nothing at all except his own breath freezing inside his coat. At the center of one such stretch stood Tower 6. Tower 6 was a two-story wooden structure built in 1906 on a small rise between the villages of Hyannis and Mullen. It controlled a critical junction where the westbound single track narrowed further before entering a long grade through the highest of the dunes. The tower was painted a dark oxide red that had faded over the decades to the color of old brick. The upper floor contained the operations desk, the telegraph key, the lever frame for the switches below, and a small potbelly stove. Behind the tower stood a two-room quarters where the signalman lived. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was a well outside the door that froze solid 4 months out of the year. The signalman assigned to Tower 6 in 1937 was a man named Wendell Marsh. Wendell Marsh was 59 years old. He had been widowed for 8 years. His wife Etta had died of pneumonia in the spring of 1929, and after her burial in the small cemetery outside Hyannis, he had requested a permanent transfer to the loneliest post the railroad could offer him. The Chicago Burlington had agreed without argument. Wendell had worked for the company for 31 years without a single unexplained absence and without a single error entered into his personnel file. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 4 decades handling cold iron, thickened at the knuckles, permanently marked at the base of the right thumb by an old scar from a switch lever that had closed on him during a thaw in 1914. Wendell recorded every railway movement that passed his tower in a leather-bound logbook that the company issued to all signalmen. He wrote in a slow, deliberate hand with a fountain pen, and his entries were among the neatest in the entire Burlington system. For each train he noted the locomotive number, the number of cars, the direction of travel, the exact time of passage in hours, minutes, and seconds, and the weather conditions at the moment the last car cleared the switch. His logbooks contained not a single crossed out line, not a single ink smudge, and not a single entry that later investigation could contradict. Wendell Marsh did not misremember. Wendell Marsh did not exaggerate. Wendell Marsh did not embellish. The Chicago Burlington in the depths of the Depression was operating at a fraction of its former capacity. Freight traffic across the sandhills had fallen 70% from the tonnage figures of the previous decade. The trains that still passed Tower 6 were livestock trains moving eastward toward Omaha and coal trains moving westward toward Denver. Every one of these movements was scheduled 48 hours in advance by the Central Dispatch Office in Lincoln. Wendell received the schedules by telegraph and confirmed each passage with the tower to his east and the tower to his west. There were no unscheduled trains through the sandhills in 1937. The single track could accommodate movement in only one direction at any given time. A train that departed a station without clearance from the dispatcher risked a head-on collision that would destroy both locomotives and kill every man aboard. No engineer of any experience would ever have taken a Baldwin consolidation onto that track without written authorization from Lincoln, without spoken confirmation from every tower along the route, and without a green signal displayed at every junction. It was not done. It could not be done. It had never been done. Which is why what Wendell Marsh heard at 2 hours and 47 minutes on the morning of the 19th of February in 1937 was, from the first sound of it, something that could not have existed. The night in question had begun as a quiet one. The temperature at midnight had been 18 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. By 2 in the morning it had dropped to 21 degrees below zero. A fine dry snow was falling across the dunes in a thin, steady curtain. There was no wind. Wendell had entered his post at 6 the previous evening and had already logged the passage of 2 eastbound livestock trains. The last message from the Lincoln dispatcher had come in at 11 o'clock, confirming that no further movements were scheduled through Tower 6 until 6 the following morning. Wendell was seated at the operations desk. He had just refilled his coffee cup from the enameled pot on the stove. The kerosene lamp on the desk cast a small circle of yellow light across the ledger. Outside the windows, the snow fell straight down through the still air. The only sound in the tower was the slow ticking of the wall clock, an American Waterbury movement that had been mounted above the telegraph key since the tower's opening. At 2 hours and 46 minutes and 30 seconds by that clock, Wendell heard a whistle. The sound came from the east, from the direction of Alliance, perhaps 8 or 9 kilometers down the track. It was faint but perfectly clear in the still air. Wendell recognized it before he had time to think about recognizing it. It was the 2-chime whistle of a Baldwin consolidation locomotive, and from the depth of the second note, he judged it to be a machine of the 05 series, one of the older heavy freight engines that the Burlington had operated across the plains before the introduction of the larger Mikados in 1920 1926. Wendell set down his coffee cup. He turned to the schedule ledger. There was no train scheduled. He turned to the telegraph. There was no message pending. He wrote in the observations column of the logbook the words "whistle heard, direction east." No corresponding schedule. He noted the time to the second. Then he stood up and walked to the door that led to the outside balcony. The balcony of Tower 6 ran along 3 sides of the upper floor. Wendell stepped out into the cold. The snow settled on his shoulders and on the brim of his cap. He walked to the east railing and looked down the line. At a distance of perhaps 5 kilometers, cutting through the falling snow, he saw the headlight of a locomotive. The beam was moving at the steady pace of a freight train under normal load, approximately 35 miles per hour by his practiced estimation. It swung slightly with the small curves in the track as the train came on. Behind the headlight, Wendell could make out, even at that distance, the darker mass of the locomotive itself and the long, low line of cars trailing behind it. He watched for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he turned and went back inside. The telegraph key was mounted on the wall beside the operations desk. Wendell sat down and worked the key in the code that would raise the tower at Alliance, 31 miles to the east. He asked whether any train had been dispatched westbound without prior notification. The reply came in 90 seconds. Negative. No traffic scheduled. Track confirmed clear. Signed by the Alliance dispatcher on duty, Harold Bick, whom Wendell had known by his telegraph hand for 22 years. Wendell read the reply twice. He wrote it into the logbook word for word. Then he stood up and walked back out onto the balcony. The train was now less than 2 kilometers away. At that distance in the falling snow, Wendell could see the shape of the machine with reasonable clarity. It was, as he had judged, a Baldwin consolidation, a 280 wheel arrangement, a heavy freight engine of the type the Burlington had built its western operations around in the first 2 decades of the century. The headlight was of the older reflector kind, not the sealed beam that had come into use in the 1930s. The smoke rising from the stack was thick and dark, consistent with soft coal firing. The locomotive appeared to be moving under full steam with no indication of braking as it approached the tower. He began to count the cars. They came into view one by one as the train rounded the last shallow curve before the tower. Boxcars, all of them of the standard 40-foot Burlington type, painted in the darker brown of freight service. Wendell counted them under his breath as they came on. At 2 hours and 51 minutes exactly, the locomotive passed directly beneath the tower. Wendell was standing at the north railing of the balcony, perhaps 4 meters above the track. The steam from the boiler rose in a thick white column. As the engine passed through the still cold air, he looked down into the cab through the open side window. He saw a man seated at the controls. The man was of middle age, perhaps 45 or 50, wearing a peaked cap of the older railroader style with a narrow brim. His face was lit from below by the orange glow of the firebox. He was looking straight ahead down the track. He did not glance up. He did not signal in any way. Wendell read the number painted on the side of the cab in white letters against the black of the smoke box. It was clearly legible even in the falling snow. 2419. The locomotive passed. The tender followed. Then came the cars, one after another in the slow rhythmic thunder of a heavy freight under full load. The couplings rang. The rails hummed. Wendell kept his count. The final boxcar passed at 3 hours and 5 minutes by his pocket watch. Behind it came a single caboose, of the standard Burlington cupola type, showing a red marker lamp at the rear. The caboose continued westward. Wendell watched the marker lamp recede toward Mullen until it was swallowed by the falling snow. He had counted 37 boxcars. The passage of the entire train had taken 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Wendell went back inside. He sat down at the operations desk and wrote in the logbook in his same steady hand the details of the passage, locomotive number 2419. Baldwin Consolidation 05 series, 37 boxcars, 1 caboose, direction westbound, time of passage 2:47 through 2:51, weather light, snow, no wind, temperature 21 degrees below zero, engineer observed in cab, middle-aged, peaked cap, not identified, track clearance not confirmed by dispatch, reason for movement unknown. He signed the entry, then he waited for dawn. At 6:20 in the morning, the sky began to lighten over the eastern dunes. The snow had ceased at some point in the previous hour. The world outside the tower was uniformly white and uniformly silent. Wendell had not slept. He had drunk 4 additional cups of coffee. He had reread his own logbook entry perhaps a dozen times. At 6:30, he sent a message westbound to the tower at Mullen. 31 miles from Tower 6, along the single track in normal freight service, a westbound train moving at 35 miles per hour would reach Mullen in approximately 53 minutes. If the train that had passed Tower 6 at 2:51 had continued at that speed, it should have passed Mullen at approximately 3:44 in the morning. Wendell asked Mullen to confirm the passage of a westbound freight. Locomotive number 2419, 37 cars, 1 caboose. The reply from Mullen did not come for 17 minutes. When it came, it was longer than usual. The Mullen dispatcher, Cyrus Freyd, wrote that no westbound train had passed Mullen at any point during the night, that the track sensors, which registered the vibration of any passing locomotive through pressure plates set beneath the rails, had recorded no activity between 11 the previous evening and the sending of the current message, that the local track inspector had walked 3 miles of the line east of Mullen at first light and had reported the rails clean, the ties untouched, and the snow between them undisturbed. Wendell sat at the desk for some time after reading this message. Then he telegraphed Alliance a second time and asked Harold Bick to check with the yardmaster at Alliance to confirm that no locomotive numbered 2419 was present in the yard, had recently departed the yard, or was scheduled to arrive. Bick's reply came at 7:40. It was brief. No locomotive of that number is on our roster. No westbound movement has been authorized in the past 12 hours. The yardmaster reports all engines accounted for. Wendell did not reply. He walked outside instead, down the wooden stairs to the ground level, along the base of the tower to the track. He stood beside the rails and looked east along the line as far as the light in the low haze of morning cloud would allow him to see. The snow between the rails was smooth and unbroken. There were no fresh marks upon it. There were no depressions from the wheels of a passing train. There was no soot upon the ties. There were no drops of oil upon the ballast. There was no scent of burnt coal in the still cold air. The rails themselves were coated in a thin uniform layer of frost that could not have survived the passage of a heavy freight engine within the previous 4 hours. Wendell knelt down beside the eastern rail and touched the metal with his bare hand. There was no residual heat. There was no vibration. There was no evidence of any kind that anything had passed along the line. He walked west from the tower for perhaps 1 full mile, following the track through the dunes. The snow between the rails was undisturbed for the entire distance. There were no wheel marks. There were no cinders. There was nothing at all to indicate that anything larger than the falling snow itself had touched the rails. He walked back to the tower, climbed the stairs to the operations floor, and wrote a second entry in the logbook. He noted the discrepancy without commentary. He did not offer an interpretation. He did not use any language of alarm. He signed the entry beneath the first. In the days that followed, Wendell Marsh conducted what could reasonably be called a private investigation. He continued to work his regular shifts, and during his hours off, he wrote letters through the company channels available to a signalman of his seniority. He asked the historical office of the Chicago Burlington in Chicago for the records of every locomotive numbered 2419 that had ever operated on the system. The replies came over the following 4 weeks. The records were unambiguous. The number 2419 had been assigned to exactly 1 locomotive in the entire history of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. That locomotive was a Baldwin consolidation of the 05 series, delivered from the Baldwin Works in Philadelphia in November of 1911. It had operated across the western divisions of the Burlington for 12 years. On the 7th of March of 1923, it had been involved in a low-speed derailment at the Grand Island Crossing during a switching movement in dense fog. The locomotive had suffered structural damage to the frame that the company mechanical department judged uneconomical to repair. The engine had been condemned and sold as scrap to a steelworks in Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh works confirmed by return correspondence that the locomotive had been broken down for its metal in the second quarter of 1924, some 13 years before the night Wendell Marsh had watched it pass beneath Tower 6. There was no possibility of confusion with a different engine. The Burlington did not reuse locomotive numbers. The frame had been melted down into structural steel that had been sold to a bridge contractor in Ohio. It did not exist. It had not existed for the entire period of Wendell's assignment to Tower 6. Wendell filed the correspondence in a folder inside his desk. He continued to work his shifts. He did not discuss the matter with the dispatchers. He did not raise it with the divisional superintendent. He did not write letters to the newspapers. He made no attempt to interpret what he had seen. He simply left the entry in the logbook as it was, and he waited. The waiting lasted 22 months. On the 14th of December 1938, at 2 hours and 49 minutes in the morning, Wendell Marsh heard the same whistle. A thin dry snow was falling. The temperature was 17 degrees below zero. He walked out onto the balcony. He saw the same locomotive pass beneath the tower at the same speed with the same engineer at the same window. He counted the same 37 boxcars in the same single caboose. He timed the passage at 4 minutes and 19 seconds, 1 second longer than the passage of the previous February. When the marker lamp of the caboose had disappeared into the snow to the west, he walked back inside and wrote the second entry. He telegraphed Mullen at dawn. Mullen reported the track clear and the sensors quiet. He telegraphed Alliance. Alliance reported no dispatched movement. He walked the rails and found the snow unbroken. The pattern held for the next 7 years. The third passage occurred on the 22nd of January in 1940. The fourth occurred on the 6th of February in 1942. The fifth and final passage recorded by Wendell Marsh occurred on the 11th of March in 1944. Every appearance took place between 2:45 and 2:55 in the morning, during a light snowfall with little or no wind moving from east to west. Every appearance showed the same locomotive, the same 37 cars, the same caboose, the same middle-aged engineer in the peaked cap staring straight down the track, and the same total passage duration of 4 minutes and 18 or 19 seconds. None of the appearances was ever confirmed by any tower to the east or to the west. None of them ever left any trace upon the snow, the rails, the ties, the ballast, or the sensor plates. Wendell recorded each one in the logbook in the same slow, deliberate hand. He never offered an interpretation. He never used a word of alarm. He never referred to the passages as anything other than movements of a locomotive numbered 2419. He retired from the Chicago Burlington on the 1st of October in 1945. Having completed 39 years of continuous service without a reprimand, he returned to Hyannis and lived alone in a small house behind the Methodist Church until his death in 1959. He was buried beside his wife in the small cemetery he had left 30 years earlier. The logbook of Tower 6 was archived in the historical vault of the Burlington Northern in Omaha. It remained there without particular attention for several decades. In the spring of 1962, a maintenance crew was replacing a section of ballast on the line half a kilometer west of Tower 6. During the excavation, the foreman noticed a heavy rectangular object embedded in the earth beneath the outer edge of the ties. The men dug it up and cleaned the dirt from its surface. It was a steel identification plate of the type mounted on the running board of Baldwin consolidation locomotives during the first 2 decades of the century. The paint had long since weathered away, but the stamped number remained clearly legible. 2419. The plate was checked against the company records and was confirmed to match the numbering pattern of the locomotive melted down in 1924. There was no record of when the plate had been buried beside the tracks in the sandhills. There was no record of who had placed it there. There was no record of how it had come to be separated from the locomotive it had been mounted upon nearly 4 decades earlier, and buried at a precise distance of half a kilometer west of a signal tower that had not existed at the time of the locomotive's scrapping. The plate was placed in a wooden box in the historical vault in Omaha. It remains there. Tower 6 was decommissioned in the spring of 1971. The newer automatic block signals installed along the route made the man tower obsolete. The building was not demolished. The telegraph key was donated to a museum in Grand Island. The kerosene lamps were discarded. The tower itself still stands. It is visible from the rail line to any freight crew passing through the area. The windows are boarded. The balcony that once ran along 3 sides of the upper floor has collapsed on the south and west sides. The eastern portion of the balcony remains intact. It faces the direction from which, according to the logbook of Wendell Marsh, a locomotive numbered 2419 approached Tower 6 on 5 separate occasions between 1937 and 1944, always in the small hours of the morning, always during a light snowfall, always at the same steady speed of a heavy freight under full load, and always continuing westward toward a station where it never arrived. The rails are still in place. In the winter, when the snow falls thin and dry across the dunes, and there is no wind to disturb it, the track between Tower 6 and Mullen remains untouched for hours at a time. The snow settles evenly upon the ties. The country is silent for many kilometers in every direction. No further passages of the locomotive numbered 2419 have been recorded since the retirement of Wendell Marsh. Whether this is because the passages ceased when he ceased to observe them, or because no observer since has been present in Tower 6 between 2:45 and 2:55 in the morning during a light snowfall in the depth of winter, is a question the surviving records do not answer. Wendell Marsh's logbook remains in the historical vault in Omaha. It is bound in dark leather, worn smooth at the corners from 39 years of daily handling. The entries for the 5 recorded mornings are written in the same neat, unwavering hand as every other entry in the book. There is no marking of any kind to distinguish them from the routine passages of scheduled freight. They record what was heard. They record what was seen. They record what was verified with the towers to the east and the west. They record what could not be found upon the rails or in the snow. They do not attempt to explain any of it. They are signed at the bottom of each page with the same steady signature. Wendell Marsh, Signalman, Tower 6, Chicago Burlington and Quincy Railroad.